Welcome, and thank you for coming to my presentation today about the Star Wars movies and the correct order to introduce a new viewer to them. First, we need to address a big question. Why bother with Star Wars? To put it simply, this franchise is full of iconic characters, stunning creature designs, flashy imagery, and most importantly, it has lightsabers, guys. I mean, what more could you ask for from a franchise? Even more than that, this fictional galaxy is full of emotional moments and imagery that fans can connect with in a truly meaningful way. There are lessons we learn from the stories presented and arcs that we can relate to that provide insight into our own lives and the world around us. Quick disclaimer before we get started, I'm narrowing this down to only the 9 films in the Skywalker Saga, so the animated shows, live-action Disney Plus shows, and standalone Star Wars Stories movies will not be included in our main discussion today. So, where do we start? There are 4 main ways to watch the movies that I'll present to you. We have the release order, the chronological order, something called the Skywalker Legacy or Machete order, and my own personal concept I'm calling the Poetic Legacy order. Let's start with the release order, which sees us starting with the original trilogy of Episode 4, A New Hope, Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, and Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. This is the original trilogy starting point, and from there, we go to the prequel trilogy of Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Once we get through the prequel era, we end on the sequel trilogy of Episode 7, The Force Awakens, Episode 8, The Last Jedi, and Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. The concept here is very simple. The order the movies came out in theaters is the order in which you watch them. Now obviously, a benefit of this order is that you are introducing a new audience to the movies in the same way the rest of the world as a whole was introduced to them, which means the biggest plot points are revealed in a way that will prevent any big spoilers. And you also get to start with one of the strongest entries in the franchise, that being A New Hope. The main drawback has more to do with the way modern audiences consume media. Because the original trilogy is a bit slower and more character-driven, younger audiences who are used to big, flashy set pieces may not be grabbed by the movie in the same way audiences were back when the effects were newer and more impressive. Up next, we have chronological order, which has us starting obviously with the prequel trilogy being Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. From there, we move on to the original trilogy, which consists of Episode 4, A New Hope, Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, and the original trilogy wraps up with Episode 6, The Return of the Jedi. Once we finish that, we finish up with the sequel trilogy, which is Episode 7, The Force Awakens, Episode 8, The Last Jedi, and of course Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. So this is pretty obvious as well. It's basically just watching it in the correct timeline in universe. So in interviews, the creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, actually said that this is the way he would recommend people watch the series, because the events in the story presented is one solid narrative without any jumping around. It's more straightforward. This also has the benefit of starting with some of the flashier and more exciting set pieces, which are more likely to entertain modern audiences. On the flip side of that, we have a few drawbacks to this viewing order. Many of the big plot reveals are spoiled by watching the prequel trilogy first, which negates the overall impact of some of the scenes in the original trilogy. We also have to suffer through Jar Jar Binks up front, along with some of the CGI and dialogue from the prequels that does not age well at all. The next two orders require me to talk about spoilers, so here's the fair warning. If you don't want to hear any plot details from these movies, you should turn off the video from here on out. The Skywalker Legacy, or Machete Order, starts with Episode 4, A New Hope, and Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, before jumping back to the prequel trilogy of Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. After that, it then jumps back to Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, and then finishes up with the sequel trilogy of Episode 7, The Force Awakens, Episode 8, The Last Jedi, and, of course, Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. The thought process here is that after the reveal in The Empire Strikes Back that Darth Vader is Luke's father, you then go back in time to watch Anakin as he falls to the dark side, before seeing him be redeemed in Return of the Jedi. This order was thought up before the sequel trilogy was a thing, so those don't really play into the arrangement really at all. With this edit, the big reveals are mostly kept intact and enhanced by providing additional context once the reveals happen. You also get to start with A New Hope, which, once again, is one of the strongest entries in the series, and it creates a stronger thematic narrative centered around specifically Luke and Anakin Skywalker. This also has the same drawback as the release order, in that modern audiences might not be initially on board with the slower pace of A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, and it also suffers from the fact that the sequel trilogy is just sort of there and feels like a lacking conclusion after the redemption in Return of the Jedi. And now on to what I call the Poetic Legacy. This one has the most jumping around, but hear me out. We start with The Force Awakens, which introduces pretty much every relevant main character to the narrative. After it ends with Rey meeting Luke Skywalker, we then jump to A New Hope, where we can see his start as he gets introduced to the larger galaxy and begins harnessing his Force abilities. During that movie, we hear Obi-Wan talk about Luke's father Anakin, who was killed by Darth Vader. And so we then jump back to The Phantom Menace, where we see Anakin get his start. These three movies together introduce us to the relevant characters and create a definitive link between the three central protagonists throughout each of the trilogies, those being Rey, Luke, and Anakin, as they all start very isolated but are invited into a much larger world full of promise and wonder. From there, we jump to the next phase, which starts with The Empire Strikes Back, in which we see Luke act impulsively to save the ones he loves. This leads to a low point for him, in which Vader reveals that he is actually Anakin, Luke's father. Then we go to Attack of the Clones, in which we see the start of Anakin's downfall as he also tries to save the ones he loves, but ultimately fails, which leads him to a place of anger where he is vulnerable and we see his descent towards the dark side. We finish this arc with The Last Jedi, which shows Kylo Ren following in Vader's footsteps as he fully embraces the dark side, and we get some core themes and messages, those being that masters fail, but through those failures, there are lessons to make a brighter future, you win by fighting for the ones you love, and the idea that hope is what builds strength. The final arc of this begins with Revenge of the Sith, where we see Anakin fall to the dark side due to manipulation from Palpatine. Then, we jump to Return of the Jedi, where we see Luke help to redeem his father, as together they resist and temporarily defeat Palpatine. Finally, we end with The Rise of Skywalker, where Rey realizes that it doesn't matter what circumstances she was born into. At the end of the day, she holds on to the hope for a brighter future, and she harnesses the strength of the Jedi to finally defeat Palpatine. Since this order starts with one of the newer movies, it's more likely to appeal to a modern audience and fit with the type of movie they are used to seeing. It creates a stronger thematic connection between all 9 movies in the saga, and it also fixes some of the issues with the narrative in Episode 9 by having Palpatine be a main threat and have his presence felt consistently, as opposed to just not being built to at all in the final third of the saga before the finale. Unfortunately, there are minor references to some big reveals that might take away some impact from the earlier movies, and frequent jumping between timelines in the narrative as well as technical differences between the movies may be jarring to some viewers. So let's revisit the question. What is the correct order to introduce someone to Star Wars? Well, I have to admit, even with my bias towards my own poetic legacy concept, there really isn't a correct order to introduce someone to this franchise. The truth is that everybody watches movies differently, and some people may be more interested in the slower, character-driven original trilogy, while others might be more geared towards the flashy and meme-heavy prequel trilogy. And heck, some might even be more inclined to enjoy the incoherent and obviously unplanned sequel trilogy. It doesn't really matter how someone is initially introduced to Star Wars, whether it's the animated shows, the live-action shows, the movies, the games. Heck, you could even start with the books. There's plenty to choose from. At the end of the day, the main takeaway is that there are plenty of options, so whatever a new fan is interested in, let them start with that. The important part of introducing someone to any fandom is that you can bond over just enjoying the experience of something that you both love. And with that, let me just say thank you for taking a look at my little PowerPoint. It may not have lasted that long, but I hope it left you feeling at least a little satisfied.